Tai labas rytas visiems, matau, kad jau 10 valandą, tai siūlau pradėti mūsų susitikimą. Ir kolegos, manau, kad prisijungs vėliau, kas dar yra neprisijungę. Tai dar kartą labas rytas visiems. Žodžiu, šiandien jau yra mūsų trečiasis Žemės ūkio ir miškininkystės dekarbonizacijos darbo grupės susitikimas.
Good morning. I hope those who are late today will join us a little bit later. I would like to introduce myself to every one of you. I'm advisor to Minister of Agriculture on issues of climate and environmental protection, Ministry of Agriculture, and during the first part of our meeting, we will have consultants presenting the preliminary assessment of the measures that are being planned for the sector of agriculture and forestry. You will have an opportunity to ask questions, and then during the second part of our presentation or meeting, we will have Oecd experts presenting their opinion about the preliminary research in agriculture and forestry, and we will speak about climate neutrality by 2050. They will share their insights, their examples, and then we will have a chance to share our opinion and ask questions. Just like it has been mentioned, we are using 2 languages, English and Lithuanian, for the purpose of this meeting, and most probably you already renewed your Zoom version in order to be able to hear interpretation. At the bottom of your screen, there should be a new icon, a white globe, with a word next to it, interpretation, and once you click on it, you will be able to choose the language, the working language of one of the working languages of the meeting, Lithuanian or English. And you're most welcome to ask questions in Lithuanian, to discuss in Lithuanian, and it will be interpreted into English. That would be it about interpretation. What concerns the duration of our meeting, we are planning to fit into 2 hours. It might be that we will finish earlier. And this meeting is also being recorded and being live streamed via YouTube.
As you see, based on the subjects of the measures, we named the thematic groups, which is regulatory changes, which are related to the regulatory changes of the legislation. Also, the research and development measures, which includes the feasibility studies, for example, to identify the territories for the new seedlings. Another thematic groups is increasing the absorption potential of forests, which includes measures like that are focused on the sustainable forest ecosystems. And based on these measures, the support is given to the afforestation and reforestation. Another thematic group is efficient use of forest resources. It should be also noted that based on the classification of European Commission and the content of these measures, we identified the type of exposures. You can see that economic exposure is prevalent because in these measures, the support is provided to entities. Other exposures is regulatory and research, and one of the exposures is voluntary or negotiated agreements, which seeks for agreements between the regulatory institutions and target groups. Also, I should note the coordinating entities, the abundance of it. As you see, not only the Ministry of Agriculture coordinates the measures, but also other institutions of the Republic of Lithuania. The rest, forestry measures, as you see, can be treated as they're focused on the soil protection, and these measures provide investments for more sustainable methods and installations in order to protect soil. And these measures are mostly economic and investment measures, including the voluntary and negotiated agreements between the regulatory institutions and target groups. And as you see, the Ministry of Agriculture is the key coordinating entity. As we move to the agricultural measures, we can see that there are 16 measures, and 6 of them are educational measures because they are related to the education of farmers and advisory measures. There are also several measures for the regulatory changes and 2 measures that are related to the compensation.
Recording in progress.
For the compliance with the requirements. And also there are measures that were used to investment for modernization of technologies. The rest fiscal measure groups is related to the taxation reforms, which is related to the increasing or decreasing of tax rates. For example, increasing in the tax on air pollution from stationary sources, etc. And the coordinating entities are more abundant here because the measures are both coordinated by the different ministries of the Republic of Lithuania. So this is the short overview of the measures, and we can see that from the 34 measures, 28 measures remained unchanged as they were foreseen in the plan. In case of one measure, in cooperation with the Energy Ministry, a detailed project is being implemented, and in case of 4 measures, which you see in the below table, it is proposed to change the names of the measures because these new names are already used in the policy environment. Another important aspect to be discussed is the funding resources. As you see, this is the information based on the inputs provided by the ministry experts, and as you see, speaking about the forestry sector, the total funds amounts to 345 million euro, including the projects that are being implemented now and are planned. And in case of other measures, there are still processes ongoing on negotiating the funding, and this amount can be changed. The major part of funding amounts for the European Regional Development Fund and the state budget. Also, the European Regional Development Fund for 2021-2027 and the European Agricultural Fund for Rural Development. Also, there are other sources of funding. Speaking about the sources of funding for agricultural measures, you can see that the total amount is almost 115 million euros, which is interim amount because there are still measures that are negotiated, and the major part will be account for European Agricultural Fund for Rural Development, and at least 1/3 of funding will be accounted for Modernization Fund and Climate Change Program. This amount will be financed also by several funds. Finally, talking about the policy measure current situation in implementation, you can see the updated information which was provided by the responsible experts, and you can see that we have additional information about implementation status, about the implementation period, and the funding sources. Speaking about the forestry measures, we can see that measures are still in the planning phase, and they will be implemented in 2022. Speaking about the research and development measures, we see that the measure related to the crops, it will be implemented in 2022 and financed by the state budget. And another measure it will be implemented by 2030, and it will be funded by the LIFE program. Speaking about the forest absorption measures, we see that 4 or 5 measures are being implemented right now, and one of the measure of the short rotation caucus is almost implemented right now, and measure related to afforestation should be finalized at the end of this year. And the end of the implementation period of other measures is planned for 2025 or 2027. We also can see that one measure is in the planning stage and will be implemented in several years. Speaking about the source of funding, the major funds will be provided from the European Agricultural Fund for Rural Development, and it will also be funded by the state budget. Speaking about the effective resources, forest resources use, this program, this measure will be implemented after 2022, and it will be funded by the European Regional Development Fund. The rest of the forestry measures are focused on the economic effect, and there are 7 measures to be implemented. They will be implemented mostly in 2023, including one measure of protection of organic soils will be planned for 2022. The source of funding is mostly European Agricultural Fund for Rural Development and state budget. Also in this table, you can see the measure of promotion of intermediate crops, which is implemented right now, and it is planned to be finalized in 2030. Talking about the final list of agricultural policy measures, we can see that measures related to education and information, 4 of the 6 measures are implemented right now and will be finished by 2030. A couple of measures that are oriented to informing and advising of farmers are planned for 2023. And talking about regulatory measures, they are planned to be implemented within several years ahead. Talking about the source of funding, the major investment is planned for European Agricultural Fund for Rural Development, and some measures will be funded. The funding is not yet identified because it is still under coordination. Next, we can see that the compensation for the commitment enforcement are implemented right now, and they will be finalized in 2030. Here, the fund is also the European Agricultural Fund for Rural Development and the state budget. In case of investing in modern agricultural technologies, one measure is under implementation right now, and another is still in planning stage. And the last group is the changes in agricultural taxation. Most measures are planned for the next year. And the reducing of the use of fossil fuels in agricultural, forestry, and fisheries is under implementation right now and will be finalized by 2030. This is the current status of the evaluation after collecting information from the ministries and other resources. And in the second part of the presentation, it should be noted that we have evaluated the socio-economic impact criteria, because the measures of forestry and agricultural are most focused on the GHG emission reduction, but they will also have the socio-economic impact. European Commission also encourages member states to evaluate those impact criteria. That is why we have decided to evaluate whether these measures will have impact on job creation, impact on social exclusion, on air pollution, the development of the circular economy, and economic competitiveness. And this assessment of the socio-economic impact criteria was quantitative and mostly implemented by the experts of ministries who based their information on their knowledge and know-how and distributed the impacts between different areas. And by assessing this impact, we also assessed whether measures have direct or indirect impact. For example, whether some of the measures have direct impact on the number of jobs created. And also we evaluated whether the impact is positive or negative and what is the size of the impact. It should also be noted that the following is a summary assessment of the socioeconomic impact for both sectors, both forestry and agricultural sectors, because they are interconnected. And we can see that they also overlap in some instances because coordinating institutions also cooperate and coordinate their activities. Therefore, we decided to assess these impacts for both sectors jointly. In case of the impact on the number of job creation, at least a half of the measures will not have any impact on job creation, and more than 1/3 of the measures are directly focused on the increase in job creation. The impact is between low and mid-sized, and even 16% of measures which were not initially focused on job creation will have the indirect impact on this criteria, but it will not be very high. Also, we saw that relatively low amount of the measures might have indirect negative impact, but this impact is very low. For example, such measures as L5, L7, A4 might have a relatively higher direct positive average impact on the number of jobs created in comparison to other measures. Talking about the impact on social exclusion, we identified that at least half of the measures analyzed will have no effect on social exclusion, but more than 1/5 of the measures are directly focused on reduction of social exclusion, and more than half of the measures will have an indirect impact on this criteria. But the expected effect is low in all cases, and such measures as L1, L10 were assessed by the ministry experts as having a direct positive impact on social exclusion, although it will be quite low. Next is the impact on air pollution, and we can see that more than half measures is directly focused on reduction of air pollution, and more than 1/3 of measures will have an indirect impact on reducing air pollution. The scope of the impact is varying from very low to average. And the relatively low amount of the measures will have an indirect negative impact on air pollution, which will be low. And the rest of the measures, 13% of the measures, will have no direct impact on air pollution, such as measures A15, for example, will have the highest relative direct positive impact compared to other measures. Talking about the impact on the circular economy, quite a few measures will have an impact on this criteria, but at least 2/3 of the measures are directly focused on the development of the circular economy, and the impact is expected as being average, and at least 1/3 of the measures will have a higher direct impact. The impact which is indirect from the measures is low or average, and such measures as A12 or A15, based on the content of the measures, will have no effect on the circular economy. Finally, talking about the last criteria, economic competitiveness, most of the measures will have no impact on this aspect, but at least more than half of the measures are directly focused on the increase of economic competitiveness, and this impact is expected to be quite low. Although some of the measures will be, their impact will be average, and more than 1/3 of the measures will have an indirect positive effect. And such measures as A4 or L18 will have a relatively higher direct positive impact compared to other measures. This is the current situation of the agricultural and forestry sectors measures which are implemented and their impact, socio-economic impact on the key criteria. And we hope that the results of the evaluation will promote good work in.
Ačiū labai, Karolina, už pristatymą. Tai matau, kad jeigu turite klausimų, tai...
Thank you very much for the presentation. Should you have any questions, please raise your hands. I also see some comments in chat. But before that, I would like to focus on several aspects. First of all, we discussed two sectors. That is land use change, and forestry. And this distinction might actually cause some misunderstanding, because some of the measures seem to be more applicable to agriculture, but still all of it is related to greenhouse gases and other related issues. From time to time, some of the statements seem to be a little bit strange because we are not used to seeing them in that context or in that combination. But now we are speaking about several aspects that are not quite in line with the strategic plan, because the strategic plan is also now being harmonized. We know all the sums, we know all the plans for the future, and not all of them have been fully reflected in this assessment. And again, our goal is, after we get acquainted with all the measures, to continue meeting and discussing all those measures in greater details by looking into which of the measures are most suitable for a longer period, and which of them do not meet our needs, which of them have already expired and most probably should not be transferred into our future plans, and so on and so forth. As I said, we will return to those measures in our later meetings, and we will discuss them in greater detail then. Those of you who are raising your hands will soon be given the floor, and Mindaugas, you were the first one to raise your hand. Good morning. I have a question regarding L2. You said that this measure has expired, but in general, has this measure been introduced at all? Because at least I haven't heard about this measure being used anywhere. Now you included it in the assessment and said that measure L2 has expired, but I haven't heard of it being included into the plan. I am sorry, I cannot react right away. This measure was reviewed, just like I said, because we had to review all the measures that we have foreseen in the National Energy and Climate Action Plan. You mentioned that L2 as a measure was not actually implemented. We based our assessment on the information that we received from the Ministry of Environment, and we were told that this measure wasn't that popular, and this was the information that we received. And what concerns more details on the matter, I'm sure that the Ministry of Environment could comment on that in greater detail. I would like to add, this measure was applicable before 2014. We had plans to apply L2 in our further agricultural activities, but because of the agricultural policy, it was not implemented at all. Not a single applicant could receive support for this particular measure, L2 in particular. So some of the measures that were mentioned, they have never been applied. Actually, they only exist on paper. Thank you, Mindaugas, for your comment. You mentioned that this measure existed before 2014. Maybe some of the colleagues would like to comment, because I'm not in a position to do that. If there are no comments on this particular question, I'm now giving the floor to Eimantas, who is raising his hand. Good morning. Thank you for the presentation. I wrote my question in chat, and it is related to impact assessment. Recently, Wageningen University was assessing the impact of the Green Deal on agriculture. And they came up with the result of 12 billion reduction in income. And this size of reduction in income also has some socio-economic impact. This is why I have a question about your impact assessment. How did you do it? Was it a questionnaire-based assessment? Yes, no, more yes than no? Or did you do some kind of calculation modeling based on a particular model? The criteria of socio-economic impact were mainly based on qualitative and expert assessments. And in essence, we took into account the information, or based on the information that was provided by representatives of various ministries. So this was a qualitative assessment. It did not include any quantitative calculations. Thank you. This means that it is not an exact socioeconomic impact assessment. You are right. This is a preliminary assessment. Alphonsus, the floor is yours. And please introduce yourselves. We are a private company, waste management consultants. This socio-economic impact assessment is cannot be assessed in no way, because this is just an opinion. It's merely an opinion, an impression of civil servants, I would say. And at the same time, there are a number of universities, Wageningen and others. They are saying that competitiveness of agricultural sector of the European Union will go down drastically because the consumption to produce 1 unit of something or the cost of producing 1 unit of something will increase drastically. So we have to admit and bitter truth and say that the Green Deal has some doubtful consequences. And there is a serious dispute regarding competitiveness, but other assessments, they are not based on much. This is not an assessment at all. I would say it's just sharing your opinion. It looks like someone went to a market, product market, and had a discussion on what kind of prices will we have 2 years ahead. Who else would like to comment? Good morning, Judita Kukiene from the Ministry of Environment. I would like to comment. The goal of our consultants was to assess the measures that have already been included in the National Energy and Climate Action Plan, to see how effective they are, to what extent they are being implemented, and to what extent do they contribute to our socio-economic goals and also to other aspects. We will also have a serious socio-economic assessment, which will be implemented by the Ministry of Economy, and then this assessment will be based on serious calculations, and this was our first step, so to say, just to have an overall impression about the situation, maybe not to the extent that some of you would like to have it, but this is the first step allowing us to have an impression of what is happening and what kind of socioeconomic effect will those measures have. I would like to say a few more words. I don't think that we should be doing those things in areas which are extremely important and serious for agriculture, farmers, and everything. This looks more like a comedy because now we clearly see that production costs per unit of production are increasing, and since production costs are increasing, competitiveness is going down. And the things that you are saying, sound like a joke, but please listen to the bitter truth that I'm sharing now. Thank you to both of you. Thank you, Alphonsus. Thank you, Judita, for sharing your opinion. And I also see that Gadas is raising his hand. Please introduce themselves. We know each other, but there are also external experts who don't know us. Gadas Pakauskas, the Union of Lithuanian Farmers. I saw one slight mistake. Excise-free fuel, all fuel duties. So we do not have excise-free fuel. And have you calculated to what extent the greenhouse gas reduction will be achieved as a result of applying those measures? To what extent will they reduce the amount of emissions in agriculture, or will we continue discussing this later? Thank you for the correction. We will take it into account regarding the excise-free fuel. And what concerns the calculation of impact on the reduction of greenhouse gases, this is already the next step. And to my opinion and to my mind, this calculation should be made based on the quantitative data, on relevant indicators, and as far as I understand, this is supposed to be finalized towards the end of spring. Thank you. What concerns the review of National Energy and Climate Action Plan, certainly, just like Judita mentioned, we will do some additional reviews and calculations. And what concerns the majority of the measures included in the National Energy and Climate Action Plan, we already have certain calculations on the impact, which results in the reduction of greenhouse gases. And I'm sure that the situation will be very close to what is described there. Once again, thank you. Now we see the shortcomings or disadvantages of this assessment. So this is just a collection of opinions and questions and answers. What will you actually use this assessment for, and what is the applied value of this assessment? And I would like to mention that the current National Energy and Climate Action Plan includes some incorrect calculations. If you have a look at the aforementioned plan, you will see that the impact over the span of 10 years indicated in the action plan is 10 times smaller than it actually is. And we also have 30,000 swarms that suddenly appeared in our statistics. What about the carbon stocks in swarms, because we also allocated a lot of money for the restoration of wetlands. I would like to react to the first part. The initial goal was to systematize and renew the information that is needed for the National Energy and Climate Action Plan. And this renewed and reviewed information should become a starting point for our future discussions on what kind of future measures should be applied. This should also allow us to identify which measures are still lacking, which measures have to be improved, and which of them actually overlapping. And I'm sure that this should be a starting point for the next stage of our operations as a working group. Thank you. Thank you very much for all your comments regarding the impact assessment, and we do agree with that. We also had much bigger calculations, just like you mentioned. And last week, we also had a meeting on similar issues. And we also mentioned that some of the measures and ecosystems are not appreciated enough. And we will continue working on the matters that you mentioned. Mantas Butrimavičius, the Ministry of Environment. a brief comment on what this analysis be used for. The goal of the consultants was to collect information about the status of measures that are being applied, to identify whether there were some changes to the financing of those measures, and based on this renewed information, then the impact of every single measure on the reduction of greenhouse gases will be recalculated. And then in spring, we will introduce new data. For the time being, we do have all those assessments at hand, and based on the result of this analysis, we will also do the recalculations that are waiting for us in the future. Thank you very much, Mantas. I'm sure that we now can start with the second part of our meeting, that is the presentation of OECD experts. I am now giving the floor to Laura, who will be making an introduction. Good morning. I'm extremely happy to see all of you here. Thank you for all of your insights. They help us improve. And I'm also happy to have other consultants, external eyes, so to say. They can have an external look at our plan and the corrections that are being planned. And now we are talking about one measure that is towards climate neutrality by 2050, reform options for Lithuania. And we have experts here, OECD experts, who will provide their recommendations for the interim period by 2050 in order to achieve net neutrality by stages and towards the end of 2050, also towards the end of 2040. It is important to mention that it will not only be pure recommendations, but also various scenarios or proposal of various scenarios in the overall context of OECD. And the sector of agriculture is extremely important for all of us. And our social partners also noted that competitiveness of agricultural sector is of great importance. I hope that our colleagues from abroad will provide us with an objective
So, dear colleagues from OECD,
view of the situation.
Now to make your presentation.
So, laba diena ir ačiū už.
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to speak. Our presentation will be in English.
Some of the same participants as in the workshop on industry on Tuesday, and I apologize that the first part of the presentation will be the same as on Tuesday, so you will hear the same introduction. I'm Sigita Strumskytė from the OECD Environment Directorate and managing this project on reform options for climate neutrality in Lithuania, which is part of European Commission's Technical Support Instrument Initiative. And I would like to thank European Commission and DG Reform in particular for funding the project and making this important work possible. And also I would like to thank the Ministry of Environment and in particular Climate Policy Group for the excellent collaboration that we have since the project started in November. And we are very much looking forward to successful outcomes of this project that could also set example for other EU countries. Next slide, please. So in this first part of our presentation, I will provide an overall introduction to the project, and then my colleagues will elaborate on more specific details, and also with a special focus on agriculture and forestry. At the end of our presentation, we would like to share with you some questions for your reactions during the Q&A session. Your feedback is very much welcome as it will help us focus better our analysis and make it more relevant for all involved stakeholders so that we can propose recommendations that are adapted to Lithuanian context. Next slide. So here let's start with the current situation. You must know very well these numbers, so I will not elaborate on it much. Just to mention that emissions in Lithuania have remained stable since 2005, but in order to get to net zero by 2050, we need to bring them on a downward path. Transport and agriculture appear as biggest emitters, and transport emissions are still increasing. Next slide, please. So following the new European climate law from June last year, the net zero greenhouse emissions target by 2050 has become legally binding for all European EU countries. The legislation also sets a new target for 2030, collectively reducing the net greenhouse emissions for EU countries by at least 55% compared to 1990 levels. Next slide. So now the new national targets for the non-ETS sector and the effort sharing regulation are based on per capita GDP as the main factor, followed by cost effectiveness. But for Lithuania, the increase in the target is substantial, from a 9% net emissions cut relative to 2005 levels by 2030 to a 21% cut. Next slide. So as we know, the Lithuanian government has set high climate policy ambitions in line with this overall new picture at the EU level. It is very welcome to see that the national and sectoral emission reduction targets are revised in the NCCMA, as they provide a key framework for reaching these ambitions. In particular, the target for emissions cut in the non-ETS sectors is at least 25%. So above the 21% required under effort sharing regulation. But the difficulty, and as we heard, is to translate this increased ambition into policy actions that delivers effective and efficient pathways to these reductions, and which also considers economic, social, and distributional aspects of this transition. Next slide, please. This is a graph from the last year's OECD Environmental Performance Review. It shows data from the last greenhouse projection submission to the EU based on the current National Energy and Climate Plan. The currently planned measures will not be sufficient to meet the new targets and the NCCMA. In particular, the increase in the target emissions cut from the non-ETS sector from 9% under NECP to 25% under NCCMA, shown here by a cross, requires additional measures. We can also see that getting to a reduction of 85% in overall emissions in 2040, as shown by the triangle, will require new measures beyond those envisaged in the NCCMA. So we therefore welcome your plan to revise NECP by mid-2023 to make it consistent with the country's climate neutrality goal. Next slide, please. So to kickstart our analysis, we are relying on our recent collaboration with Lithuania, in particular the 4 reports shown here, which is Environmental Performance Review, Energy Policy Review, Economic Survey, and Effective Carbon Rates. Next slide, please. So according to both most recent OECD